Actually, with news just breaking today that Hannigan is demanding ransom payments from corporations such as the BBC, Boots, British Airways, and several others, unfortunately, or fortunately for us, this topic is probably more timely than ever. They're all purportedly victims of their MoveIt hack, so this discussion really couldn't be any more timely. Cybersecurity and cyber resilience are also both areas of investment in the school's research strategy as digital technologies are becoming all pervasive, but also as geopolitical tensions are moving ever more powerful actors, including nation states, into the arena of cybercrime. Both vulnerabilities and threats grow in tandem. And therefore, understanding how organizations can prepare for the event and the consequences of a cyber attack is therefore of great organizational but even macroeconomic importance. So in this context, I'm particularly proud of our research collaboration between Saïd Business School and ISTARI, who we're going to introduce in greater detail in a moment. It demonstrates that excellent research can be directly relevant in the world of practice and is testament to our ethos of doing great research in collaboration with corporate partners. And particularly, I'm pleased that the work that Manuel actually originally started while being a doctoral student here at the school now continues to flourish in this way and in his new role as Head of Knowledge and Insights at ISTARI. And it's my pleasure to co-host this panel with him tonight. And that, of course, brings me to the particular delight and great thanks of tonight. I'm very grateful to welcome tonight's esteemed panelists who have volunteered their time to share their unique insights with us. To my far right, it's my great pleasure to welcome Rashmy Chatterjee. She is the CEO of ISTARI, which is a global cybersecurity investment and advisory firm set up by the Singapore investment company Temasek. At $20 billion of investments in cybersecurity makes it the largest pure-play investor in cybersecurity, and its advisory business helps clients build cyber resilience. Rashmy is actually wearing two hats tonight, or three. She's also a co-author of the report, but she's also a member of many boards, including Allianz, where she chairs the technology committee.
I'm going to introduce Bob, and the reason why Michael and I are cuddling on this red sofa tonight is that we will be co-moderating tonight's panel. So allow me to introduce Bob. And Bob Dudley is the former CEO of BP, that all of us are familiar with. He's had a very distinguished career at BP. He was working there for more than 40 years and was the CEO between 2010 and 2020. He also sits on many, and I probably can't count them, boards of directors, including large companies. The reason why he's a great person to join the panel tonight is because he has extensive experience dealing with crises, but also he is the chairman of a company called Axio, which provides cybersecurity quantification services, because he's realized that cybersecurity needs to be quantified in financial terms. But we'll get to that later on. So thank you for being here.
Next to Bob, it's Robert Hannigan, the former director of GCHQ, which is the UK's largest intelligence and security agency. In that role, he led the creation of the UK's National Cyber Security Centre and oversaw the UK's pioneering activity, Active Cyber Defence Programme. During his 20 years of public service, Robert was the Prime Minister's security advisor and created the UK's first cyber security strategy. Who would be better placed to talk to us tonight about the broader macroeconomic and geopolitical implications of cybersecurity as well? Currently, Robert serves as the chairman of BlueVoyant International, which helps companies build cyber resilience inside and outside their company networks. Welcome, Robert.
And finally, allow me to introduce Eleanor. Eleanor Murray is the Associate Dean for Executive Education here at the school. Her research interests aligns very closely with my research interests in that she's interested in the resilience of organizations. And her research has been quoted extensively in practitioners' journals, in news media, and I'm very glad that she brings the perspective of resilience to tonight's panel, so thank you for being here as well.
Right. Now, as one of the co-authors of the report, Rashmy, if I may come to you first, you have so much experience in the field of cybersecurity, cyber resilience. What motivated this report in particular? And for you, given all the experience you bring, what were the kind of standout insights or potentially even surprises to someone as seasoned in the field as you?
So first of all, delighted to be here, and very happy to be together with friends and collaborators. You know, for a long time, cybersecurity was seen as a cost center. I would often hear people say things like, it's the brake to digital transformation. At ISTARI, right from day one, we've always believed it is a business imperative. You cannot be a responsible leader, drive digital transformation without ensuring a very solid foundation. And that foundation eventually has to be integrated into your business management, into risk. We're just shifting from a physical world to a digital world, and with that comes some changes in how you lead. So we had always started with this belief that cybersecurity should be a CEO imperative. And you know, Manuel and I spent some time to say, okay, what does that mean? We found lots of reports which highlighted what the industry, the vendors feel CEOs should do to become more resilient. But there was nothing that showed how do CEOs feel about it. Like, do they think it's important? We've run a few CEO events, and you know, there's always demands on time, right? So how do they feel about it? And we thought, what better way to figure out than to actually do the primary research ourselves and understand how do CEOs feel. And it was very interesting because we spoke to 37 CEOs across the world, all three geographies, and very large companies, you know, one of the top 3 banks in the world, and to smaller companies. And in all cases, it was interesting because when you first tell the CEO that you want to have an hour-long discussion with them about cybersecurity, it's discomfort. You know, I have a great CISO, no, but we really want to talk to you. But can I have my CISO in the room? And we assured them that it won't be a technology discussion. We just want to understand how they approach cyber resilience. So yeah, that was why we set out, because we believe it's a business imperative. We believe it's led from the top. We actually very strongly believe it's not just about technology and processes. It's about much more. It's about organizational resilience. And the research set out to get more into the mind of the CEO and how they think about it. You know, one of the sort of, don't want to, you know, kind of go into the full research, but the first thing that we discovered is almost all of them think cybersecurity is one of their top 3 concerns. So it is very, very present. What's happened today is what most CEOs worry about before they go to bed. And then, of course, through the process of the research, we found, learned more and published what we thought were some direction, some guidance for the CEOs.
What was, if I may, kind of the standout insights or that the CEOs offered? Because I understand it was not just about the technology, the human aspects, how they felt about the crisis that they encountered.
Yeah. So from a problem statement perspective, as we spoke to the CEOs, pretty consistently a few things came out. The first is when you shift the conversation from cybersecurity to cyber resilience, they understand it. Actually, almost every interview that we started, we would ask about resilience, no cyber. And these are CEOs who all come off a generational crisis with the pandemic. So the word resilience meant a lot to them. They could talk about it, how they had led through this complete change in the world. And then when you link it to cyber resilience, that becomes much more of something they see as their ownership, something that they're accountable for. The fact that if there's a crisis, they will lead the face of the crisis recovery. So that was the first insight, that cyber resilience resonates much better than cyber security. The second insight is, so what? And what we found is that most of the CEOs think of themselves as the generals, right? The buck stops at me. I will lead our team out of this, crisis. Many of them had lived through the crisis and had led their businesses out of the crisis brilliantly. But what did that mean before the crisis? What could they have done differently? That was some of the things that the research points out. Small things like, are you accountable or are you co-responsible? Because there is a difference. Co-responsibility means spending quite a lot of time understanding your risk landscape, being a leader in defining your risk appetite, prioritizing your risk, being prepared, things like that. And that also implied a shift from blind trust. They all trusted their CISOs a lot. I think that was something very good. They'd spend a lot of time recruiting and hiring great people who were their CISOs, and there was a lot of trust. And I think in almost all the conversations, it was clear they supported the CISO. Budgets, etc., time was not a problem. But how do you move from blind trust to informed trust, right? How do you understand the CISO's challenges in an increasing threat world, increasing digital landscape world? How do you help them? So I think the second thing that came out was that there's got to be a change in mindset. And I think the third big insight was that the current frameworks don't help CEOs become more resilient too well. The current frameworks which define NIST and sort of orange, red, green don't help the CEO understand what's most important to my business. And, does it really help him understand, am I spending time and money on the right things? Am I spending enough time and money on what I should be? So the frameworks that they were working with were more of a checkbox versus something that really guided them to do more.
So, Bob, let me turn to you. And I saw that you were nodding while Rashmy was speaking. So I'm glad we weren't too far off with the research that we did. Now, you've been a CEO. You've had that seat for 10 years. Cyber, I think, was on your agenda at the time. But as a CEO, you have to manage all of these different priorities. And I can't speak from experience. I can speak from observation. But then all of a sudden there's a crisis. And you've been through many crises. And some of the CEOs that we interviewed, 9 of them had actually suffered from a devastating attack. And it was quite telling to listen to their emotional stories because it was something very deep and very personal to them. Now, the lessons that the crises that you've been through while you were at BP, what lessons emerged from that? Is there any lessons on crisis management, crisis preparedness that might be relevant for CEOs to prepare for a cyber attack that's devastating and potentially life-threatening to the company?
Well, thank you. And thank you very much for being here today and everyone being here. I was probably a little bit different. For a while, BP became known as Big Problems because we did have lots of crises. We were dealing with them, it seemed like every month. But my first experience with cyber came in a different way in that I was running a joint venture, 115,000 people in Russia for 6, 7, 8 years. And so my view of cyber, data security, communications, and everything was I came back into BP from that whole experience thinking, we have no idea how it really is happening out there. And so I brought that in, and in fact, you and I met one time about it. So I was always someone who thought cyber was a threat, resilience was a threat, but that what we needed to do was drill over and over and over the management team on many kinds of crises. And so we put together pretty sophisticated crisis rooms, not only in Houston and London and Sunbury and different parts of the world, but we used those rooms. We didn't use them for anything other than dealing with the crisis, and they had the technology there, made sure we had the right people. But we drilled through it. We worked through the governance of it so that who's clear? Is it the management's doing it? Is it the board of directors are stepping in? Who's doing what and when? because you can trip each other over each other, all trying to help. And so we had various layers of it. And through that drilling, we found scenarios that things we never thought about could happen. Of course, we had real crises. We had, terrorism in Algeria that killed 150 people. And of course, the Gulf of Mexico was a never-ending crisis, it seemed like, that went on for months and months and months. But we did things like on the cyber side early of understanding, what's the data people are coming into our retail shops and buying petrol and food. Well, you have a lot of data on that, and what happens and what can happen if you lose that data through some data breach. And of course, it's very, very expensive, and we just never thought about those sorts of things. We drilled the response, the communications, because communications is everything. As your report says, Rashmy, you communicate within your organization, you communicate with government to tell them what's happening, you have investor relations, and you have customers out there. And you really have to think that through, because that just comes at you so fast. And so I visited someone, and I said, what could go wrong with this refinery? It's the second largest refinery in North America outside of Chicago. And I said, how can somebody get into the control rooms? And so we hired a company, we hired Accenture actually, and they went in, and within 2 weeks, they were able to take control of the control room of that refinery and make it look like everything was just fine. So they could have pushed buttons, they could have blown things up. And it was all due to just the loose 3 or 4 engineers that were doing their remote access into this giant refinery. Now, I didn't sleep after that for a long time. And so we put a task force together and went around the world and retooled every single one of our assets because of those things that can happen. So these things can be real. We had our emails brought down by Iran at the time that they went after Aramco. I spent a lot of time with Aramco in their cyber. If you can get these companies to go through their lessons, it's amazing. And there's one that's quite common now, that's the Maersk, if you ever understand the Maersk shipping one. I mean, they ran that company with faxes and pencils for months. I mean, the things that you have to do and improvise around crises, you'll never get it right. These things will just happen. And then you got to keep everybody calm. I mean, I think I was in one crisis, and I could just see the management team spinning up, and you've actually got to calm, systematic what you do, get the right people involved, including government sometimes. So those are just a few things I learned in my dealing with crises, if that's helpful.
I think it is very helpful. Let me just respond to that. I think something that you said, Rashmy, about cyber is not all about technology, and I think that reinforces the point, right? The drilling, and there's a lot that companies can do to prepare for something like that doesn't relate to technology. Yes, cyber is always and will be a technology conversation, but there's a lot of things that CEOs and management teams and boards can do to help prepare the organization for something like that, which also speaks to the broader notion of resilience. So thank you.
A footnote to what you said here is get your management team to really drill, because there's always one or two who will say, oh, this will never happen. Well, if they don't take it seriously, don't have it been part of the drill. I mean, you'll see all kinds of personals.
And as a side note, it would have taken ISTARI only a week to get into the refinery.
A week to do what?
Joking aside, but I want to pick up on some aspects of what you said. You started your explanation thinking about the joint venture you were running, talking about remote access, which really starts to challenge the notion of the boundary of an organization when we talk about cyber resilience. And I think especially when we think about cybersecurity, we still have these very kind of old school ideas of patrolling the organizational perimeter. Now, Robert, if I may ask you, why do CEOs seem to struggle with the idea that cyber resilience is being built throughout the supply chain through third-party risk? How do we affect this mindset shift that it is not just around the organization, but much, much wider.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and thank you for laying on such a brilliant example of a supply chain attack this week, actually. As you mentioned earlier, the Klopp statement this morning. I think it is a brilliant example because it illustrates that attackers, whether they're nation state or criminal, don't give up when they find a well-protected company. They go for the soft entrance, and that's usually the supply chain. So most companies have experienced a supply chain attack in the last year. And once you're in there, you've got this fantastic choice of targets. So big companies like BA, BBC and others. So it is a great example, actually. To answer your question, though, why do CEOs find it tough? Well, I think it goes back to the excellent report that Rashmy mentioned, the understanding of CEOs. It's really tough to get visibility of your supply chain. The average small company in this country and European countries have 1,000 plus vendors. Some I've dealt with have 10,000 plus. So the scale is a problem. Understanding the dependencies, which is more a business issue actually than a cyber one. When you try to tier your suppliers, even when you map the supply chain, you've got your 10,000. Trying to decide which are the critical ones for you is quite difficult, and typically you do it by spend. You say, well, here are the 10 biggest spending suppliers, but they're not necessarily where the cyber risk comes in. So who would have heard of the small software company in Ukraine that was the cause of the NotPetya incident that took down Maersk? Nobody had ever heard of this company. Probably nobody's heard of the payroll provider for BBC and BA and others. So working out those business dependencies and criticalities is really, really difficult. I think the other problem of understanding is that cyber is a very dynamic threat. So your networks are changing, the attackers are changing, the attackers are looking from the outside all the time for weaknesses, for vulnerabilities to exploit. They're doing that 24 hours a day. And you need to do that as a company. And I think you're absolutely right that we've come from an era where we thought about the perimeter of our company and our networks, and we thought if we defended that really well, it was sorted. But things have moved on, and I think CEOs do get frustrated that, I spend all this money protecting my networks, and now you're telling me that it's the ecosystem and it's all the companies who are either embedded in my networks or connected to them or are processing my data outside my networks that are the problem. And unfortunately they are. So the perimeter has melted away. Risk has got a lot more complicated. And the only answer, regulators are onto this, governments are onto this, is to start monitoring the supply chain and doing it continuously and prioritizing risk and then doing something about it. So, I think the key final point is you can reduce risk in the supply chain. Just admiring it and quantifying it isn't enough. You can actually drive it down. You won't get to zero, but you'll get to maybe 10%.
And now let me turn to you, Eleanor. Now, you've done extensive research on resilience, and we've talked a little bit about risk, a little bit about resilience. What was interesting is the title of the research is the CEO Report on Cyber Resilience. It's not the CEO Report on Cybersecurity. And the reason for that is because a lot of the CEOs who had been through an attack realized that what matters is the resilience of the business from a couple of different perspectives: reputation, operationally, financially. Now, from all of the research that you've done, why do CEOs care so much and boards care so much about resilience, and how could they think about building it in their enterprises?
Yes, I think resilience is a really strategic issue. It's not a technical issue, as all the panel members have all alluded to. It is strategic. And in my research, I've looked at sort of 4 key areas where resilience is really pertinent, and they're all sort of core areas of the business. It's performance, strategy, risk and recovery. And one of the key elements of this is that resilience is always about paradox to an extent, because on the one hand, you're trying to create reliability in your business, you want robust processes, and you want to ensure there's no sort of technical loopholes. But on the other hand, I think as Robert's alluding to, it's all about being dynamic and having adaptability, because things keep changing the whole time. We know that crisis, there's huge opportunities for crises in the current geopolitical situation. And so businesses have to be able to adapt very quickly and be responsive to a dynamic situation. So CEOs and boards are really trying to hold those 2 elements, which are sort of potentially paradoxical of reliability and adaptability at the same time. And I think that's a key sort of learning that's crucial to board function.
And I think just to pull out that adaptability point, when Bob and I walked down earlier today, he said, actually, this panel made me reflect a little bit about all of these crises that I've been through and made me realize that, well, actually, you can't fully prepare for them. There's always something that's you haven't thought about or that you just can't anticipate, although how hard you try. So how do companies and management teams, Ellen, how do they shape and drive that ability to adapt to new things in their environment? What can they do?
Yeah, so I think it's about being future-facing and being really alert to weak signals that are coming towards them. So that's weak signals are sort of those early trends, early patterns that potentially show an issue might be emerging. And I think it's very easy for boards and CEOs to get very bogged down in the here and now and be sort of responsive and reactive to all the issues that they're trying to deal with. But it's about building in that prospective ability to look ahead and actually have some time to think prospectively. I think in agile methodology, you're always encouraged to do retrospectives, but I argue in resilience terms, it's important to do prospectives and find ways to build into the way the business functions, a way of looking forward and anticipating those early weak signals.
So CEOs are expected to monitor all these future-facing weak signals. As I understand, Robert, they have to do so across the entire supply chain, the entire supply network. That's a lot. And I recall one of the CEOs in one of the interviews really said, like, I should have an unlimited budget for cyber resilience. Now, I see from your reactions that might be optimistic to be signed off. But Bob, if I may tap into your experience and also your role in Axio at the moment, how can CEOs get a sense of when they're doing enough? How do they quantify how much is actually a realistic investment in cyber resilience, short of asking for an unlimited budget in that field, given that all of the complexities we've just heard about?
Well, for years, I would see it at the board twice a year, maybe twice a year. We do a cyber review, and it would be green, amber, and red under these categories. And I used to think, well, okay, well, do we have too many reds? Or does the green make me feel good? I don't know. And so that's when I got involved with and learned about Axio, which do a cyber risk quantification calculation. They look at your critical assets and they go through and monitor your company and they say, okay, if these things go wrong, this could be the financial impact for your company. And then, of course, and there's some other companies that are doing that as well. And then now insurance companies, and I know at least 3 or 4 insurance companies, and one for a South American oil company who's used this Axio method and has reduced the insurance premiums now because they begin to think, aha, this company actually understands what its risk could be. So you're seeing these sort of new tools that are coming out, and they're changing ways. It's hard to get cyber insurance now as well. So some of these risk quantification tools are going to be really important going forward. But when you go through and you look at your critical assets of what could go wrong in that refinery, I gave you an example which could have been a multi-billion-dollar issue. I mean, that puts it in perspective of where you should be putting some of your money and risk and applying the risk to it. And then retooling those kinds of things that are quite vulnerable. You may not even realize you have. And yes, it can be expensive. And your board says, okay, well, you can only have 80% of that, when you go through that debate. But it should be part of your critical. I think it needs to be part of the capital allocation program of big industrial companies.
And if I may quickly follow up, in the interaction with boards, it's like we've learned also through the report that there is a certain level of discomfort amongst CEOs considering cybersecurity. People feel a little bit out of their depth. What I still found the most striking figure was that I think 72% of the CEOs in the study did not feel comfortable making decisions in the area of cyber. What is the importance of risk quantifications, insurance premium changes like that, to actually also educate boards about the importance of cyber resilience and justifying investments like that?
I'm I'm seeing and hearing more about the criteria that boards are looking for members to join their boards now with some cyber background experience. So you can see that coming into the board selection processes. Mm-hmm. Now, I'm not necessarily a believer that you bring in somebody who's on the board as a cyber expert and then they're the cyber expert. I mean, you need a lot more than that. But I think boards are becoming more liable for lots of things, financial risk and cyber risk. I think you've told me about some examples of cyber risk where companies have actually been fined.
And in recent cases, the person has had to, actually I think in the US, there's been the first case where the person has got jail time for the cyber breach. So it's, just on Bob's point, I think the risk of the cyber threat will keep growing. The geopolitics, the sophistication of attackers, that will keep driving an increased cyber threat. The more boards can understand that threat in context of risk, the easier it is we make for them to make the right decisions, right? If you keep throwing the threat, it's hard to react. It's sure, as you said, unlimited money would help, but resources, unfortunately, are limited. So converting it to risk is very helpful to the board.
We're keen to hear more from you on your experience on boards in a second. I just quickly wanted to invite both the audience here in the room, but also the audience online to join the conversation in a few minutes during our Q&A. So please feel free to submit questions through the QR code or the Mentimeter link that's shown on the slide, and we look forward to you joining the conversation in a few minutes' time.
Yeah, I can also see there's a few questions that are coming in from the online group, so we'll pick those up in a second. But Rashmy, I want to follow up on some of those boards conversations. Now, Bob, you sit on many boards. Rashmy, you sit on many boards. But you've joined the board of Allianz, which is one of Germany's largest companies. They do a lot on cyber. You've joined that board not only because you're familiar with technology and you have that deep knowledge and expertise on cyber, but because of all of the other qualities and leadership qualities and the experience that you've gained. But from joining this board and all of the other boards that you sit on, what's your experience? How do boards interact with cybersecurity risk? And the small anecdote that I can share, I think it's okay to share to kind of broker this topic a little bit, was we held a chair and CEO forum in Zurich last year. And after that chair and CEO forum, one of the chairs approached us and said, I look around and I sit on quite a lot of boards, and we don't have a clue about cyber and we don't know what to do about it. Is there anything that you guys can do to help us? So hearing from you firsthand how boards deal with that, what are the challenges that they face? What are the challenges that you face as a board member who's knowledgeable about this stuff when you go into these boards?
Yeah, I think, all the boards, if I think through, first and foremost, cybersecurity and cyber resilience is very important. There is nobody who says, this is priority, low priority in their work. So when you say something is important, how do you address it? You could say things like every board meeting will have a topic, or we can look at our frameworks, etc. But I think that unless you integrate it with risk, it's very hard to do anything about it. That's what I meant taking off, extending on Bob's point. Boards are very familiar with governance. They're very familiar with compliance. They're very familiar with risk. In a board, often the first committee that's set up is the audit risk committee. So the closer you get to integrating cyber resilience and cyber risk into enterprise risk, the more you simplify the board's ability to support. As long as it is this separate thing as part of technology, that alone is not, I don't think it makes it easier for the boards. And then when you get it closer through the risk dialogue, now boards are comfortable with that. They understand there's threat, they understand there's impact, they understand that they have to make the assessment of what is the threat, what could be the impact, what's more important. Then the last point I would make is how do you move that conversation, how do you extend it from beyond the technology to other factors that can cause tremendous risk, like organization. You can have a large organization that spends billions on cybersecurity and may have the organization structure could be confused. When you're at crisis mode, the two things that matter most is chain of command and hence speed of response. So if your chain of command at that point is not very clear, you've just given the attackers a lot of leverage. Organization matters. Attrition, are you losing talent in that space? Ecosystem is everything. Robert talked about the third party, how is their risk assessment, fourth party risk. And the most important thing then, which we will start talking about in the future, we're still trying to figure it out, is product security. When you get a product into your environment, when you get a product into your house, how do you know this is secure? I think today there's some news, right, about the UK changing cameras in restricted spaces. So we're just at the beginning of the journey. There's a long way to go. And I do think that being able to converse about cyber resilience in context of a new world where threat will keep increasing, digital footprint will keep increasing, and then you understand what the risk is. That is what will help the most.
Now, obviously, as we talk about this new world and increasing threat levels, we have to discuss the recent geopolitical shifts and rifts. And if I may tap into your experience also from GCHQ, Robert, if I may, when war broke out in Ukraine, tensions are rising, possibly between China and the US. In our report, many CEOs gave a call to their CISO and says, what do we do with this? What new risks are emerging? What would be your advice? What is this new world of increasing risks like, and what are potentially the risks that you think might still be flying under the radar of some CEOs?
So I think there are some really interesting lessons coming out of the war in Ukraine on cyber and cyber resilience, which you refer to in the report, actually, particularly around the use of cloud. And I think that's changing the boardroom conversation around cloud. I remember 5 years ago, if you said to a CEO, you should move to cloud, there would be a deep intake of breath, and not just for financial reasons, but because of security and operational effectiveness. That completely changed, partly for business reasons, but partly because, as Ukraine shows, you get a fantastic resilience out of cloud, and cloud security has got so much better. Microsoft particularly, but the others are catching up. So there are some important lessons that really relate well to the ISTARI Saïd report. But what should a CEO do? Well, I thought it was interesting at the start of the war, CISA in the US and NCSC here and ESA in Europe, and actually most countries, put out guidance which they called shields up in the US, but essentially it was get the basics right. Because the truth is we know how ransomware is delivered, for example. It's basically 4 vectors of IT, what we call IT hygiene, so RDP particularly. So we know that. So if we can get those right, and they're not difficult, and you can see from the outside where there's a problem, if you get your IT hygiene right, you've massively reduced the risk. And the danger, I think, for CEOs and for boards is that they get distracted by the hype about the war, if you like, and they start thinking about incredibly sophisticated nation-state threats. And of course they are sophisticated, but the delivery of them tends to be through the same old things we've been talking about for years. So IT hygiene, failure to do proper authentication, multi-factor authentication, these sorts of things which lots of companies, particularly in the supply chain, are still not doing. And if you look at most of the attacks, that's how they're happening. And if you could get the basics right or put shields up, as the US put it, that's what CEOs should be doing, as well as revisiting their plans, revisiting their resilience and recovery plans. It's a good time to do it, and the drills that Bob mentioned. So those are the things that CEOs should focus on as a result of a conflict like this, rather than getting carried away by some of the cyber hype that you read about.
There's a lot of challenges that come out of that geopolitical space. Cyber, and I think this is something that's been talked about a lot. Cyber can't be looked at just from one single perspective. It has ramifications into geopolitics, and when the war broke out, I think there was a lot of these calls. What are we supposed to do? And the answer, as you say, might not be something completely new, but actually just get the things right that you should have been doing anyway, in other words. And I think because cyber is such a pervasive topic, it is one of those areas that leads to discomfort in business leaders. And this is, you mentioned the statistic before, 72% of CEOs feel uncomfortable making decisions in the area of cybersecurity. Now, Eleanor, I want to turn to you as the Associate Dean for Executive Education. Does that level of discomfort pose an opportunity for universities, for industry, for research, and for executive education?
Definitely. I mean, at the moment, a lot of the research is very technically focused. As we've discussed, it's much more than a technical issue. We need to really understand the broader impact for boards, for businesses, particularly thinking about the organisational impacts. So that's one key issue. We are understandably seeing a need in terms of education for boards, and I know we're jointly working with ISTARI and ourselves with a board offering to explore how boards can have that sort of broader business focus on cybersecurity and cyber resilience.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So I was actually monitoring a little bit those questions that are coming in, and we have about 15 minutes left. I think we've got more questions than we can actually get to, but you've been able to go through them a little bit. Why don't we...
It was just a very quick pickup, Robert, on your comment around cloud computing and the extension. So as many companies are still transitioning to cloud software as a service solutions, we're still seeing tools adopt. How do you see AI impacting the understanding and the engagement of CEO decisions in that space?
This is a great question. I think there's an awful lot of hype around AI, and people mean very different things from AI. I mean, clearly for attackers, we're already seeing through products that are already out there the ability to do existing fraud at scale. So to do websites at scale, to do domain lookalikes at scale, all the things, phishing emails at scale, and to do them better. So there's a very obvious quick use. And we're also seeing, I think, the use of AI to do coding really at scale and well, which can be misused. But in a sense, that's just scaling up what already happens. And good cybersecurity companies and good companies ought to be able to see that off. I think long term, we're still in the early stages of understanding what AI will be able to do for defense. There are clearly some customer-facing stuff that most of us are looking at. You know, how can you improve SOC performance with AI? But the truth is, we're not quite there yet. And I think even Microsoft, who are probably furthest ahead on this, and they've got a new product called Copilot, which is AI-driven to help security teams. There's some way to go before we really understand what AI can do for defense. We can see what it's beginning to do for offense, but I think there's some way to go yet.
Mm-hmm. So this is actually a quick question for you, Bob, from the room. You kindly left the name Zuck Paul. Do you maybe want to? Yeah, there you are. Do we have a microphone maybe so you can ask the question yourself? This is for you, Bob. So be prepared.
Where are you from? Thank you. I'm from actually Oxfordshire, so not too far. Work for Kodalski Security. Question, Bob, and really appreciate your insights that you shared on the crisis aspect. What are your views, given where you started out in 2010 and I guess left BP in 2020, but are still involved in industry, of the CISO reporting directly to the CEO versus the CIO? Because in my role, I've done boardroom simulations where we've basically simulated a ransomware attack. And often it's because the CISO is trying to convince his peers, stakeholders, and the board on coming on board with understanding the risk, the appetite. So when you start to simulate failure of a site where production facilities are going on, that's when the CFO is like, well, this is actually costing me X per hour, etc. So you get a bit more focus. But it's a constant battle we see. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's interesting because I'm working with 3 companies and they all do it 3 different ways. And I would not say that any of them are wrong. It gets down to the expertise and the personalities involved and how the team works together. I do see a lot of cyber being pushed down, and you made me feel a little bit better about it, Rashmy, but a lot of it is being pushed down now into the audit committees. Not the technology, but the audit. So audit tied with risk. I get a little nervous if we don't talk about it at the board, but sometimes it's pushed down into the audit committees, very thorough. But I think expertise, personality, and a management team, how it works, is probably the better answer and understanding of risk than a formula, than a single way of doing it. And I don't know, that's probably a confusing answer, but you gotta have a team that doesn't compete with each other. I mean, and it's the IT, you know, it's the whole thing, and the IT and even the big data experts, and you know, I've seen that, having to sort that out in organizations. You need to do that. But if you get a team, that high-performing team that works together, there's no one single answer, I think.
There's an interesting question online which I would like to pose to Rashmy, which is, I think, is an intriguing flip on the theme of the report. We focus on how CEOs need to change to enable cyber resilience. But here's the question: how does the role of the CISO actually need to adapt to better enable the CEO?
Yeah, very important as well. It's not one-sided at all. And this is actually one of the reasons why at ISTARI we set up a strategic leadership development program just for CISOs. Because many CISOs today often come from strong technology backgrounds. And the gap often is actually in business language, and again, the conversion of priorities, right? You create a lot of technology input. It's hard to consume. You know, to your question, we've written a perspective at ISTARI. If you have time, you should read it. But it's interesting. Every organization is different. I agree with Bob. Organization dynamics have to work well. So there's no single answer. But often, or many times, the CIO is tasked with digital transformation, workforce productivity, and can see cyber as the impediment to achieving those goals. So it really depends on the CIO, CTO, CEO, whatever, you know, maturity of the organization. But the fact that the CISO should always report to the CIO is, I don't think, any more valid. And especially in industries where we are seeing that the cybersecurity is about much more than IT, right? Medical devices, production systems, these are going to become a big part of entry point for cyber attackers. So you want to make sure that the CISO has line of sight to everything. But I would say the simplest answer, you know, is language. Big believer in business language. By the way, maybe 2 decades back, the CIO was the IT person, right? Until digital transformation changed the world, until you had suddenly a whole breed of CEOs who were technologists. And, you know, and the CEO got very comfortable with talking about digital transformation, agile thinking, design. You know, the fundamentals of technology became very core to a CEO role. So I think that's sort of where the CISO role is today. It has to go from the protector, and we kind of say there are 3 types of CISOs. You know, one who really spend much of their time on managing the landscape, sort of vendors, procurement, the others who are compliance driven, and then the third, which is the strategic, who is really the CISO who is the guide to the CEO on how can they always have a strategic advantage in the face of cyber threat. So, you know, as the role evolves, its language, its understanding of risk, reporting matters because that gives you visibility to what else is going on in the organization.
So there's another question in the room from Claire Matthews. I don't know if you... there we go. Can we get a microphone to her as well? And maybe this is something for you, Robert, but everybody, please feel free to contribute. So.
Thank you so much. I'm Claire Matthews from WMC Global. I'm also an executive MBA student here at Oxford. I'm curious to get your perspectives about how you develop resiliency around human vulnerabilities within corporations. The company I work for is tied to automated phishing detection and mitigation. So I'm coming at this from more of the human vulnerability angle rather than necessarily intrusion detection.
I think that's a great question, and there's been quite a lot of academic research in a couple of universities I can think of about the psychology of this and the effectiveness of these products, of which there are lots now. And it is a really tough question, I think, for CISOs as to whether there's really a return on investment. But whether a particular product works, I mean, there's no question that trying to change behavior is a large part of improving resilience. I think everybody gets that. So changing culture, which in the end comes from the CEO downwards. I mean, I think if the CEO and the board are not exhibiting the right behaviors in cybersecurity, they're not taking shortcuts, they're not demanding special privileges, that they're actually being seen to take this seriously, as they would sort of health and safety in the energy sector. And I was always really struck visiting energy companies, how seriously they took, even in headquarters where there was no real risk, they very visibly took health and safety seriously for obvious reasons. And I think if you can instill the same kind of culture in cybersecurity, you're halfway there, really. But how you do it is, I would be interested in colleagues' views on how you drive down that culture.
Well, there's a phrase that I don't like because it really doesn't work very well in Asia, but it affected three things I had been through once. And if you really want to change the culture quickly of a big company, you almost need a near-death experience to do it. Now, it's not a very pleasant thought, but I've been involved with three of those, and boy, you take advantage of that, you change the culture, and you can really do it quickly rather than incrementally. So how you change big companies incrementally in the culture, I think is hard. I think I see companies that are capable of doing it, but it can take a long time. And maybe you have to do that, compartmentalize things that just really aren't working in your company, and you just have to change something, a product line or something, to do it quickly. I mean, Microsoft did it. It came from a computer company into a software company. They're very unusual examples, though. But I had the experience of three that had, dramatic impacts. And if you don't take the advantage of it, you'll miss it, I think.
If we can just broaden the perspective on that question slightly, because it resonates with one of the questions being asked, not quite sure whether it's online or in the room, and maybe get Eleanor's perspective on the broader question. So short of a near-death experience, what have you found to be the most successful culture change mechanisms, maybe to build resilience more broadly, but cyber resilience more specifically? If maybe I could come to you first, Eleanor, about what drives the kind of culture change to a more resilient culture in an organization.
Yes, I think as Bob says, a lot of it is role modeling, and Robert says, it's about demonstrating that commitment at the most senior level to what the change you want to achieve, and then really focusing on that as a very single-minded priority in the organization to get that change in language that Rashmy is talking about, to get that, the change in language, the change in attitude and mindset is so crucial. But just really driving it through. And I mean, I know from having worked in healthcare and tried to change cultures around issues that were causing near-death experiences or actual death experiences, unfortunately, it did take time. But I think if you can focus on one single issue and really drive it through and make that a major priority, like I think health and safety has been in the energy industries, that is one way of approaching.
And I would add, strategy is always at the heart of this. And there are other strategic steps to take, and they could be mergers, acquisitions, they could be other things that you just realize you're going to have to do to really change culture. And I know some companies do that. It sounds better than near-death experience.
So let me actually pick on one question, and that may be something for you, Rashmy, because I know we've spoken to the IBM cohort earlier today a little bit about that. So someone asked from the live audience, and I didn't leave a name, so I'm going to have to repeat the question here. In the same way as we attempted to get into the minds and perspective of the CEOs, is it plausible or even possible to get into the minds of the perspective of the attackers, into the psyche of the attackers? And what would, if we were able to do that, and I know you have an answer to that, that's why I'm asking you, how would that help us defend better?
Yeah. Firstly, absolutely. There are organizations around the world who really try to understand the attacker mindset. One of the ISTARI companies, I obviously think, is absolutely fabulous at it, just understanding the attacker mindset so you outthink actually the attack before it happens. Yeah, I think, there is always an ethical question around here, how the ethical hackism, how much of it is okay, not okay. But I do think that we were talking, Eleanor, early today at lunch, when we talk about cyber resilience and when we talk about the framework in our paper, the past frameworks have sort of focused on identify, protect, defend, etc. We have an area before that which is anticipate. We were with a group of CISOs last February in Kitzbühel when the Ukraine war broke out, and the entire agenda changed because all their CEOs and boards were asking, what does this mean for us from a cyber perspective? And I think that part of anticipation means you've got to think about what's driving the attackers and therefore where will they come from. In the past, attackers were driven by sense of power, a little bit of mischief, look at the trouble I can cause, or financial gains. But today you have a very different breed of attackers. They are driven by patriotism, nation-state attackers. They are the soldiers in a different kind of war. Their motivations are very different. So really spending the time, this is exactly why I feel so strongly that this has to be a CEO level led thinking. Anticipation comes, okay, so as a CEO, if you anticipate challenges caused because of nation-state attackers or financial attackers, what are the things you would protect most? What are the things most valuable to you? And what are you doing to build protection against that? It's not an immediate protection of putting in a technology or a tool, but the kind of people that you hire, I think anticipating comes when you try to understand why attackers will want your information. Why will they want to attack you?
I feel there might be another research collaboration on the horizon. For now, however, it is time for me to thank the panelists for sharing their insights today, for participating and supporting the research that we've conducted. Many thanks, Rashmy Chatterjee, Bob Dudley, Robert Hannigan, Eleanor Murray, and Manuel Hepfer. If you would like to read the report, if you hadn't had an opportunity yet, please find it online. You can scan the QR code. It will take you straight to the report if you haven't had an opportunity to download it yet. If you think conversations such as these are interesting, then please join us again in a week's time when my colleague Mike Devereaux will be hosting a conversation about the future of the taxation of global businesses. And in the meantime, if you are in the room, you're warmly invited to join us and meet the panelists over drinks in the foyer. Thank you very much again to all the panelists. Thank you all here in the room, and thank you to those of you online for joining us tonight for our Future of Business event. Thank you very much. Have a good evening.